Mom threw me out of the house for some guy who kept us all in an iron grip. Think he was her salvation? Huh. When he landed behind bars for cheating and fraud, she suddenly remembered me, with empty hands and an even emptier soul. That's when the real hell began. Hi, I'm Dylan, 22 years old. And if you think my life is in perfect order, well, that would be the funniest joke ever. Growing up, Mom and I were inseparable. I always covered for her and she kept me afloat. We were a team, two against the world. Her support and love felt as natural as breathing. Until he showed up. Frank, yeah, that's his name. Mister, I'm the boss now. Let's put it this way. If I recorded an audiobook of my life, it would be titled How I Lost My Mom to a Medieval Narcissist. Frank, at 45, decided the world revolved around him. Apparently, Mom agreed, thinking she'd found her missing half, only older and with a nasty smirk. He didn't care that it was my mom and me before he came along, but afterward it became his personal show. In this story of the two of us, he acted like he was the only main character. And don't be fooled by his nice face either. It was just a facade for a really nasty guy. Imagine someone with the ability to radiate disdain with a single look. A real master. But you know what truly got to me? One day, I overheard them talking. I just happened to walk by the room and there was his voice, cold as ice, telling my mom, "Don't you think Dylan should be living on his own by now?" Wait a second. He just showed up in my house, and now he's deciding there's no room for me? Some time passed, and I managed to forget that conversation. I got a job, focused on my own things, tried to accept that Mom had a new guy in her life. But one night, I came home, and guess what? My things were neatly stacked by the door. Frank stood there, arms crossed, looking at me like he'd just won the lottery. Mom was behind him, her face carrying something like guilt, but she couldn't even meet my eyes. "So, son," Frank said, "time to start your independent life. Things are different now with your mother and me." His voice was like some TV announcer wrapping up the season finale. And the worst part? Mom, my mom, just stood there, nodding, like I wasn't her son standing on the doorstep with my bags. Something broke inside me in that moment. I looked her in the eyes, but she just stood there in silence, as if she'd already forgotten who I was. If you think this is a story about an easy life, brace yourself. You know how they say, wherever you go, there you are? Well, I didn't just stumble into problems. I attracted them like a magnet to scrap metal. When they threw me out, and yeah, that's not an exaggeration, I tried to get by on my own. I slept wherever I could, sometimes on a park bench, sometimes with friends who had long since tired of me. I survived as best as I could. I figured if Mom and her new king of the castle didn't want me around, I'd at least try not to hit rock bottom. Naive, right? Sometimes I'd find a temporary place to crash, strangers who'd eventually kick me out too. And of course, when you're dependent on others, your luck goes on vacation. Once I got a spot in a homeless shelter. Far from ideal, but I didn't have any other options. The next morning, surprise! My last bit of cash was gone from my pocket. You know that feeling? When you're already at rock bottom and someone tells you, "Hey, guess what? There's a few more feet down." At first I was in shock, then anger took over. My pride had long since taken a back seat, but the resentment toward Mom and Frank only grew stronger. I was filled with rage, and honestly, I'd nearly stopped believing life could ever turn in my favor. One particularly miserable, rainy day, I found myself on a bridge, staring down at the murky water below, with the thought crossing my mind, what if I just let go? Everything's gotten so bleak that carrying on feels pointless. But then I thought, are you serious? Surprisingly, something inside me rebelled at that moment. It was as if a voice in my head was saying, "You're really going to give up just like that? No way. They threw you out? Fine. Now your job is to prove they were dead wrong to write you off." So there I stood, drenched in the damn rain, suddenly realizing I wasn't just going to survive. I was going to make it just to spite them. Life has a wicked sense of irony, doesn't it? Exactly a year had passed since they tossed me out of my own home, and by then, I'd learned to live with it. No, it hadn't been a pleasant year. It was a brutal survival circus, not for the faint-hearted. But just when I thought Mom and her dear Frank were out of my life for good, a message popped up. Who from, you ask? Of course it was her. I don't even know why I'd kept her number. Maybe just to recognize it and ignore the call if it ever came. So, I opened the message, and what do I see? Mom tells me Frank's been jailed for fraud. Think I shouted for joy? Almost. Calling this karma hitting like a truck would be an understatement. And now that her strong man was in prison, she suddenly remembers me. Of course, who else could she turn to but the son she'd thrown out so she could live it up on someone else's dime? I just sat there, staring at the text, like it was some spell that would make everything suddenly clear. Mom wrote that she needed help. Ha! Really? Needed help? It's always the same. You're useful to them only when their pretty life facade starts cracking. I wanted to just ignore her message, delete it, forget everything connected to her. But, when anger's been drilling into your brain, you feel like you just can't pass up the chance to watch their perfect world crumble. So I went. Don't get me wrong, it wasn't some sentimental urge. I wasn't going there to comfort her. I went to see her face when she realized her castle of sand had washed away under the force of reality. I reached her apartment, which now looked like a depressing storage unit. No luxury, no style, just a cold, empty room with furniture that seemed to be on the verge of giving its 2 weeks' notice. Mom opened the door. She looked like life had wrung out every last drop of youth and strength, like an old lemon. Gray hair, a worn-out expression like a shipwreck survivor. Even her precious jewelry, which she never used to be seen without, looked just as broken as her face. In that moment, I felt split in two. One side of me said I should help her, while the other reminded me that she had chosen him over me. So, alas, my heart stayed cold. She began telling me things about Frank, about how he'd deceived her, and how everything was falling apart. I just listened, but inside, I felt only emptiness, except for a slight sense of satisfaction. Here it was, the price you pay for betrayal. Life in that apartment felt, well, like a never-ending scene from a horror film where the actors had forgotten their lines. For several weeks, we lived side by side in total silence. She seemed not to notice me or anyone else, wandering through the apartment like a ghost with that blank look, as if her soul had gotten lost somewhere along the way. And I didn't blame her. Losing all her civilized comforts and being left alone with the person she'd practically betrayed, that's a hard pill to swallow. Honestly, I was even a little curious. When would she finally speak up? What was she even thinking? But the silence started getting on my nerves. I felt like an audience member stuck at the world's dullest play, unable to walk out. Then one day, I got lucky. I was cleaning her room, although, if we're being honest, I was really looking for proof that she was still somehow tied to Frank. And I found something more interesting than dust under the bed. A letter. It was one of those moments when you don't even need to be a detective to know who it was from. Yep, a letter from Frank himself, straight from prison, with the prison stamp and his filthy handwriting. You might think he'd apologize, maybe? Yeah, right. Instead, the letter was basically him telling her, "Your job is to get me out of here. I know how to get out. Just do what I say." Not even a request, just pure demand, as if he had any right. He was begging her for help, but not out of guilt or regret. He had the audacity of someone who still thought he was the main character. That's when it really got to me. At first I felt rage. Why on earth was he still controlling her life from behind bars? And why was she still willing to listen to him? Throw the letter out? Block him? No, she kept it like some kind of relic. A mix of anger and disgust hit me. She still believed in him, even though he'd wrecked her life. The thought unsettled me so much that I wondered, what if she really just can't live without him? I knew I had to do something, and fast. I'll be honest with you. Watching Mom sink deeper into this deranged loyalty to Frank started to feel almost like entertainment. But there's a line where you realize it's either time to do something drastic or just sit by and watch your loved one completely lose her mind. So, I decided to run. An experiment. Yeah, not the most compassionate approach, but who said this show had to be merciful? That night, after she went to bed, I quietly slipped a note under her door. Just a simple piece of paper with something along the lines of, "If you want to get Frank back, be prepared to go all the way. You know what to do." Yes, it looked dramatic, like I was some prison philosopher. But I wanted to see how far she'd go for someone who'd basically written her off completely. The next morning, I got up early, made myself some coffee, and prepared to see what she'd do. You know those moments when you think you're ready for what's coming, but it still catches you off guard? Mom looked like someone who had just been rebooted. Her gaze was focused yet strangely empty, her hands trembling, yet she didn't react to anything. She simply moved through the apartment, collecting whatever savings she had left, all that was essentially her last lifeline. This was her one chance at a little stability. And what did she do? She sent every last cent to the account Frank had given her. Yes, my friends, this is what obsession looks like. She was like a puppet, strings being pulled with no trace of doubt or fear, just blind, desperate resolve. I sat on the couch, watching her, barely able to believe my own eyes. She didn't care that he'd ruined her life, drained her of everything, and left her with nothing. She just couldn't stop being his loyal shadow. And at that moment, when she shut her laptop and sat down on a chair, completely lost, I realized this person, my own mother, was willing to do anything for a man who would never return, who'd simply used her up and tossed her aside. There came a moment when I realized I couldn't just sit back and watch Mom dig herself deeper into this pit. Frank was still manipulating her from behind bars, and she, as if under a spell, kept following his every instruction. So, while she spun around in this vicious cycle, I decided it was time to adjust her trajectory a bit. I found a whole stack of documents in her room, all tied to Frank. It was as if he were less of a person and more of a bureaucratic nightmare in its purest form. These papers laid out the history of his genius-level scams, debts, and broken promises. Each sheet practically screamed, "This guy's a walking disaster," and I figured it was time for his legacy to end. Without much hesitation, I took the papers to the police. I felt like I was turning in the final assignment of the year, the one that would clear me of all my dues. I handed over every document, watched the officers take interest, and went home feeling like I'd made the right move. At least now Frank had a good chance of staying in hotel mode, behind bars for a while. Justice served, as they say. But when I got home, I was in for a surprise. I had no idea that Mom would find out about my police visit. But somehow, she did. She stormed into my room with a face like I'd just betrayed the whole family. Her eyes shot daggers, her voice shaking with rage. "You betrayed me, Dylan! You turned out just like everyone else! How could you?" She yelled that I was no better than all the others who had abandoned her. But, in that moment, I realized her words meant nothing to me. Standing before me wasn't the mom who had cared for me, but rather a person entirely taken over by a prison-bound con artist. Her life meant nothing to her without Frank, and that realization was terrifying. Her accusations only fired up my patience, and I snapped. I yelled back, pouring out everything that had been building up. "You destroyed your own life. You chose him over me, over everything you had, so don't expect me to come save you again. This is the end." She fell silent, and for the first time in a long while, I saw a broken person. Her face shifted, as though I'd just yanked away her last hope of salvation. And in that silence, I realized there was no saving her anymore. After a few weeks of quiet, just when I started to think Frank had faded from my life for good, a letter arrived. And guess who it was from? Naturally, none other than the Prince of Prison Cells himself. Yep, Frank had somehow decided that writing to me was a brilliant idea. Inside the envelope was a page full of threats and ego. It started with an overdramatic, "Dylan, you're in my grasp," followed by cheap threats, as if we were in some kind of mob movie. I read on, and he promised to ruin my life and expose family secrets if I didn't help him get out of prison. Oh yes, Frank was quite the dreamer. He seriously thought I'd drop everything to go fulfill his demands. Whatever he had in mind, one thing was clear. This guy was living in a reality where he was the star of the show. Every line in that letter practically screamed that Frank was a textbook example of a manipulator. This man would never change. Even from behind bars, he was still trying to control everyone around him. To threaten me, the one who helped lock him up? A stroke of genius, truly. For a second, I thought of sending the letter back with a polite note saying, "Please leave me alone." But you know what? I didn't do it. I wanted him to know his hold over Mom and me was finished. I was done playing by his rules and being part of his absurd theater. A few months passed. Life slowly settled into a normal rhythm, and I finally started to feel free. There was quiet around me, Frank was in jail, and Mom, well, I thought she was trying to piece her life back together after all that chaos. But as the saying goes, if something seems too good to be true, it probably is. One day, I ran into an old acquaintance who told me, "Hey, did you know your mom's been seen at the prison gates? She's been hanging around there almost every day." At first, I thought it was some dumb rumor, but the more I dug, the clearer it became. She was actually there. It seemed she couldn't stand the thought of Frank being all alone. He'd ruined her life, stripped her of everything, yet she kept crawling back, surrendering whatever shreds of dignity she had left. I was shocked. At first, I couldn't believe it. Then I didn't care anymore. You know, there's that moment when you realize you've done everything you can, but some people just don't want to be saved. They choose their path and stick to it, no matter what. She chose him, chose this lie, chose self-destruction. This whole story was more real to her than I'd ever been. Of course, I can't say it wasn't painful, but if there's one thing I learned from all this drama, it's that I'm done dragging her along. It's her choice, and it's destroying her. I thought I lost my family the day they kicked me out, but now I realized I never had one. All those years, I'd been holding on to something illusory, imaginary, and now I could finally let go. From that moment on, a strange feeling came over me. Freedom. I was alone, but I had a chance to build my life from scratch, without drama, without ruin.